Here's the good part. You were probably waiting for the good part, I'm guessing, right? The good part, this is just earlier this year. The Institute for Energy Research concludes in their study that there's $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the federally controlled lands. More than 9 times our national debt locked up in the federally controlled lands. Just last year, the Government Accountability Office, the chief auditor of the United States, testifying to Congress, said there is more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming than the rest of the world combined, locked up in federally controlled lands. 5 states have now passed legislation to begin instilling knowledge and courage on the federal government to do the same, on our representatives at the federal level, to do the same thing that's already been done with Hawaii and all states east of Colorado. Nevada is one of those. There's Idaho and Montana and Nevada and Wyoming and Utah. Arizona ran a bill in 2012, passed the bill. The bill was an earlier version of the bill that we had proposed that was much more stringent on privatizing land and going that direction. It passed the House and the Senate. It was vetoed by your governor. We've since had some communication with your governor's office and shared some of the knowledge that we're talking about tonight. And you already have in your House and Senate a committee that's beginning to work on formulating a bill much like the bills that have passed in some of the other states to begin studying the transition, the feasibility, and the mechanism for an orderly transfer. That's already happening, but your representatives are going to need more knowledge and courage. Certainly your governor and others, right? Knowledge and courage, and that comes from right here. In Nevada, their transfer of public land, or their public land management task force is made up of county commissioners exclusively, because they're the ones on the ground. And in their first task force meeting, they had Intertech Services, who had already done a comprehensive study on state management of public lands versus federal management of public lands in 1996. And so they presented their 1996 report, and the Nevada task force is employing them to bring that report current. Now, in presenting the report, they said, here's our report from 1996. All of the data that we have currently suggests that as we update this report, the disparity is going to be even greater. And that makes sense, of course, right? States can do manage public lands profitably. The BLM consistently spends more than it takes in to manage public lands. Now, that's a shock. BLM labor is less efficient than states in managing land, and wildfire suppression costs are greater per acre for the BLM than for states. They analyzed the states. They looked at Arizona and Utah and Nevada and Idaho. And they averaged the high. They took the high, the low, and the average of the revenues and the costs and the expenses of managing public lands at the state level on the left and the BLM on the right. Here's the summary. They conclude that on average, the states managing public land, on average per acre, yield a positive $6.29 an acre. The BLM on average loses $1.86. Now, we have reports that our school trust lands in Utah, they yield $32 an acre. States managing public land right now. We can't afford not to. You will hear the argument, one of the arguments as to why we shouldn't ever do this is that, well, you can't afford to manage your own lands. What in the world would you ever do without the federal government giving you hundreds of millions of dollars a year to manage your lands? The same federal government that is trying to print prosperity? The same federal government that is broke, that is already cutting back money right out of schools. The same federal government that is already cutting back that promise to pay 13 cents on the dollar, that is already cutting back the promise to pay the 48% of the minerals. You can't. What would we ever do? We can't afford not to. From an environmental quality standpoint, we can't afford not to better manage our lands and forests. Imagine this for a second. Supervisor, you okay if I continue to pick on you a little bit? I got a deal for you, okay? I want you to consider this very carefully. I would like to propose to you that I come and weed your garden and that I pay you for the privilege. Would you be okay with that? I'll pay you $1,000 a month to come and weed your garden for you. You'd be all right with that? That's what we used to do with our forests. That's how we managed our forests. We used to get paid for the privilege of having someone tend that garden for us. And oh, by the way, as they were in the forest and fires would start, they had an incentive to put those fires out because they were already on the ground. We can't afford not to. Because in Arizona, 52% of your revenue, single largest line item of your revenue, comes from a federal government that's broke, and it's not if or when, it's already going away. And if you can do basic math, you can see where that's going. Perhaps then it's time for a new conversation about how we address and deal with our public lands. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation that's not Republican or Democrat. It's about how are we going to educate our children in Arizona. Because Washington, as they continue fiscally suicidal over the fiscal cliff, they're not going to come educate our kids. We probably wouldn't want them to do it anyway. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation about how we better care for our lands and forests and protect the access to our lands that we enjoy and we live and it's been our heritage to use. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation about creating jobs with this resource that was the very foundation of our state and about growing local, state, and national economies.